For those who don't know your fantastic work, what do you do and what inspired you to pursue photography despite being born blind in one eye?
Well, I think the one thing I can straighten out right away, the blind in one eye doesn't actually have really any bearing,
Yeah.
because when you think of a classic camera, and you go back and think of really good photographers, um, like Cartier-Bresson, he just used one eye to take the pictures. In other words, you put one eye to the eye cup and you take the picture. So basically, the one eye thing, which people always talk about, um, is not really an issue. It has, the one eye sometimes has a depth perception, problem. Uh, but it doesn't really, that never really played too much. As why I became a photographer, I think I was on the road to becoming a graphic designer, and I was fascinated a little bit as I was going down that road with photography. But the minute I got a camera in my hand, I was pretty obsessed by what it could do. I was never obsessed by the equipment. Um, the equipment was important, and I always use the analogy of that you have to learn to drive the car before you can go somewhere, and that's a really good analogy.
Yeah.
You, as time goes on with the car, you get more and more comfortable, and then you just get in the car and go. You almost don't think about it. You have to do automatic things like indicate you're pulling out or look in your mirror. And if there's a red light, you hit the brakes and so on. So there's a lot of things like that, but you tend after a while to be automatic. So there's always can be with a car tricky conditions. You can be a normal evening, but you can have ice. And the same thing really applies to a career in photography. It can have problems, even though you're fluent with the equipment. So the idea was basically to get the technical things wherever possible. You're always learning, but to get the technical things taken care of. But definitely, I was never obsessed by the equipment itself. I was obsessed by what it could do.
Mm.
So being a graphic designer for 4 years, that helped me. And then I was at the Royal College of Art Film School for 3 years in a very good group of people that were there and that were good to be around, very kind of brilliant people. And a combination of film came out as a director, a combination of graphic design and filmmaking, and a love of photography. If you look at all the work, that's what it is. You can see the influence of film, you can see the influence of graphics, and you can very often see the influence of concept, which was very much part of graphic training.
Yeah.
So, graphic design wasn't just doing the typography for a book jacket. What was the concept? Concept was very big in the 60s. So that helped me a lot when I came to do photography. But basically, that's what I ended up being, love of photography, graphic designer, film, and you put them all in the one pot, and that's what I am.
And how has film directing, being a director and dealing with people on a shoot, how has that helped you in the studio?
Well, it's not so much helps you in the studio. It helps you a lot in handling people. I mean, a film director is handling not sometimes actors, sometimes real people, but the handling of people is what I learned from that. I mean, how do you speak to people? Can I take your picture? How do you communicate to them? Are they nervous? I photographed some very famous actors that are very nervous to be photographed. Famous people, you think, well, they must be no problem. Some famous people are no problem to photograph, and they do it all the time, and they know they have to do it. Other people can be, even famous ones can be very nervous. So in other words, how do you handle that? So therefore, the directing skills for how to handle people, how do you give them direction? What do you want? You take the picture. Okay, so Joaquin Phoenix said to me, "So what do you want me to do?" So you and he was very nervous. It was a strange shooting, and eventually we sat down and we had a cup of tea together, and I straightened that out a little bit with him.
Yeah. And there's this kind of cognitive error or bias called domain dependency, where if you have someone in a situation that they're comfortable with and that they're used to, like, for example, Phoenix acting in front of a crew of 200 people, he's super comfortable with that. But then when you take that into a different domain, when he's being photographed with just you, he's clearly completely nervous. Why are people kind of so nervous to be photographed when they're used to being on the red carpet, for example, or in films?
Well, I think the red carpet, they just stand there. I mean, that's
Yeah.
red carpet is. People stand there, and very often you'll notice the men just stand there, and sometimes the actresses pose a little bit. They put the hand on the hip, and they do a little bit of body movement for the people, but basically they just stand there. So there's no concept in that. I think one reason that a lot of actors are nervous, and I once read the biography of Alec Guinness, and I knew that he was chronically shy person. So, and they asked him, well, how do you manage to go out on a stage in front of 1,500 people and give a performance? How do you manage to do that if you're totally shy? He says, because when I walk out on the stage, I'm not Alec Guinness.
Mm.
I'm a character. So when you, I remember the first time I photographed Clint Eastwood. Clint was kind of a terrible dresser in real life because he was a golfer, and a lot of golfers are terrible dressers. And he kind of turned up with green slacks on, with a crease, and a peach-colored Ralph Lauren crewneck kind of shirt, which was not very Dirty Harry or Fistful of Dollars or anything. And when a little bit in a polite way, I asked him, I had got some antique Wrangler shirts from the 50s, and I asked him to put it on, and he said, well, what's wrong with what I'm wearing? And I told him, I said, well, look, in the end, at the end of the conversation, I said, look, Mr. Eastwood, this shot's not for your piano, it's for the cover of Rolling Stone.
Yeah.
So and he said, well, I take your point. And then he put the Wrangler shirt on and complained that it looked a bit like a cowboy shirt. And I said, well, everybody wears denim shirts, it's not, it's not just a cowboy and so on. But then once he saw the picture, he was really a different person. He saw the picture, the thing. And the first thing he said to me was, he said, you love the Polaroid. And he said, don't sell it to anybody after Rolling Stone. And he said, I'm going to use that on my biography, which he did. But he had never basically, we hadn't even taken the picture yet. It was just a Polaroid. But he knew from that. He was a pretty savvy person. As you can imagine.
Yeah.
So he was not only a persona, he was not only kind of amazing looking. And he was much bigger than I thought. I knew he was tall, but he was a pretty big guy. He had very big shoulders. So you think of him as kind of a tall, skinny guy. He was actually quite well built, So basically, sometimes back to being directed, you have to handle people and say, look, I want to do this, and sometimes you're confronted with just unstoppable people. Sometimes actors and that celebrities can be difficult. And I once photographed Susan Sarandon, and she was known for being very sexy, Susan Sarandon at the time. And she said, I'm changing my image. So she brought 24 tulips with her, and she wore a white linen suit, and she was holding white flowers, which of course they used the shot, but it was really a disaster. It was just, so these are the kind of things that can happen. I guess if I'm not photographing you, goodbye, I guess you could play that hardball, but so a lot of that is just how you handle people, how do you manage them, and so on, and that you have some kind of concept in your head. I'm always saying about photographers, the preparation is really the most key thing. And of course, a lot of young photographers, they think preparation is like setting setting up your equipment or something. I said, it's got nothing to do with that. I said, we assume that your equipment is prepared, and so it should be. And if you're thinking about discussing that as preparation, you're wrong. That's a given. You should make sure there's gas, petrol in the car, So what are you going to do? What's your idea? What is the lighting idea? Is there a concept here? Do you have a philosophy of how to do something, and so on? What's the idea? And I think that was part of being trained as a graphic designer, and I held on to it for years. And sometimes it was pretty difficult in the fashion business too, because I did a lot of fashion. I did hundreds of Vogue covers because that kind of high-powered graphic style worked very well on a cover. And so I certainly used the training I had at university all the time. I still do.
Yeah. And you mentioned preparation, and a fellow Scottish photographer who's super inspired by your work, David Yarrow, also says research is the platform for everything he does. And he says that preparation is probably the most underrated word in photography. And that's definitely something I agree with. Could you run me through in a bit more detail your kind of method of preparing for a shoot, or does it really vary depending on the subject? And
I mean, if you're photographing somebody now, with young photographers now, it's so easy for them. If you go back kind of 20 years before really mass use of the internet, you had to go out and buy books about people. So if you're photographing Steve Jobs, there was stuff available. But I mean, I went out and read everything I could find on him. And I went and bought stuff where he was mentioned in tech books. It was before his biography. And so you kind of read everything you can. I mean, if you're photographing Clint Eastwood, then you find out what's he doing now. So it's very easy to do that now because you just simply load it into the internet and out it comes. So I'm kind of amazed that young photographers don't do that. So if you're photographing back to Clint Eastwood or anybody, Michael Jackson or anybody that, is still around, that you research who they are. If you're photographing Tom Cruise, you find out what his next film is and who are the other people in the film. Do you, who's the cinematographer on his latest film, and maybe that's a connection with something that you can talk about with the person. So you're always looking for stuff to, how can you connect with, the person? And the more research you do, the easier it is to connect, so you kind of, even stuff that you never use, there's something about knowing the person that helps you go. It's not like that you have to know where, say, Steve Jobs' father came from or the story behind that. I think it helps you to know that, but you may never use that. But it gives an aura of knowledge that you can approach the person.
Yeah.
So.
And speaking of Steve Jobs, that's one of my favorite photos of yours, one of the most iconic for me, especially having his biography. As using that as an example, how did the research you did on Steve kind of influence and help you create the photo of him?
If there's nothing simpler, I mean, if you have a MacBook Pro or whatever, you close it. Nothing simpler than that. It's a piece of metal with an apple in the middle of it. I mean, it's pretty simple. So I knew that the thing to do was to work directly with him and keep it very simple. Like, don't do him in a tech laboratory or don't do him staring out of a window or something, looking at the clouds. That the idea was to be right in his face with the camera, be quite close to him. And I had a line prepared for him to, when he, I knew that he would say, what do you want me to do? And a lot of people ask that. So you should always be, as a photographer, kind of be prepared to answer that.
Yeah.
So I said to him, okay, imagine that you're across a conference room table with a lot of people that disagree with you. but you know you're right. And he said, well, that's easy for me. He said, because that's the story of me every day.
Yeah.
He said that to me. He said, that's easy. And he had this intense stare. He never seemed to blink. He was never like blinking almost. It was like once or twice he would blink. So he just had this stare. And the idea was to give me an expression that you know you're right. And he said, and then he just joked with me and said, well, of course I'm always right. So, but he was solid in that. And then when I did the Polaroid of him, he looked at it and said, that's great. Can I keep it? And I said, sure. And we always did the same thing with the 4x5 Polaroid. We put it in a little black cardboard mask thing. So it always looked very sharp, And so he kept it. And then when a few years later he died, I got a call from Tim Cook asking for the picture. And he said, I need it immediately. And I said, well, I can give it to you tomorrow. He said, I need it now. And I had no idea that he just died that afternoon. And we sent it out. And the next thing was I was out at the theater and my phone blipped. And then there was the photo that Apple used. They put out that photo and they closed down everything. I think it was for like 12 hours. They shut down everything. And all that was on the Apple website was a picture of Steve Jobs. So I think stuff like that, the main, and I've told the story many times that the PR guy came in at kind of 10 to 9. He was due there at 9 o'clock. I knew he'd be on time. And the PR guy said, just to let you know, Steve hates photographers. I said, well, I'm here to photograph him. I came all the way from New York. I can't help that he doesn't like them, sort of thing. And I said, I'm here to photograph him. He said, okay, no. He said, but just to let you know. But at that moment, that guy actually did me a favor because I kind of, I thought about it for a minute and I had him for 1 hour. But when he came in, I said to him, I have good news. He said, what's that? And he was pretty gruff, I think, in the beginning. And then he was fabulous. I said, I only need you for 30 minutes, not an hour. And he smiled and said, wow. He said, that's cool. That's great. And then, of course, he looked at my 4x5 camera and said, oh, my God, why are you still shooting film? And I said, well, I don't think digital, it was 2006. I said, I don't think digital's quite there yet. And then he pointed his finger at me and said, I agree with you. It's not quite there yet. He said, but we will get there. He said very clearly, he said, no, I agree with you. He said, but we will get there. And of course he was right. They did get there.
Yeah. And that's definitely a memorable photo. And I'm just wondering, because you always say kind of you need to create unforgettable images. Do you have any key principles that you use to make a memorable image, or is it kind of up to the public once you've published the image to decide whether it's memorable or not?
No, I mean, you have to go back to the beginning of this interview where you just look at graphics and film, and that's just written over everything. So sometimes simplicity graphics, sometimes graphic composition, and then just how I approach something. I mean, we just finished that massive project on roll, and it was pretty tough physically to do it. I had 34 12-hour days. That
Wow.
was, and I started off, I did a smart thing with research, which was even smarter than I realized, because people said, my God, that was a smart thing. And there was one aspect of being smart that I didn't realize. But I started the project by doing 8 nights, starting at 8 o'clock and working till 7 in the morning. So I started shooting at 8 and we went till 7 in the morning in Rome. So the reason that I came up with that, and it was at the end of July I started, the reason I came up with that was this idea of being able to zigzag across Rome in the middle of the tourist season, in the middle of the night when it's empty. So that was the main reason for it. I could go from A to B to C to D and very quickly. And Rome was empty. By 1 o'clock, 1:15, it was empty. So for the next 6 hours, I was free just to stop and do whatever I want, anywhere. Everything was empty. Trevi Fountain was empty. The Spanish Steps were empty. Everywhere was empty. But it was all lit through the night, which was great. All the monuments were lit. So you had this kind of free canvas of just stop wherever you like. But then what everybody said later, they said, yes, but at that time in Rome, it was basically whatever it is in Celsius, maybe 38, 40 degrees through the day. It was 105, 108 during the day. And at night, it was about 75. So it was very pleasant to work in.
Yeah.
So there were two aspects of it. One, my main reason was the emptiness of Rome. And it enabled me very quickly to get a sense of Rome, sense of space. And you can imagine, I'm not saying London's empty at 2 o'clock, but it certainly is not busy at 2 o'clock London, So if you imagine kind of zigzagging, you can get from kind of Trafalgar Square down to Big Ben, Green Park, and then go over to Hyde Park and the Albert Hall, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these things you can reach very quickly in the middle of the night. So that was one of the main, and that's just preparation.
Yeah.
So in other words, there's a lot of photographers who just arrive and they get up and start at 8 o'clock, or they might want a sunrise shot, whatever, and get up a lot earlier. But that was just an aspect. And I kept the idea of the Rome thing. The idea was, what was important was the first 8 days. That was the most important. So I was pretty hyper about making sure that I established what I was going to do, what was the approach here. And also, I really wanted to put together a show for younger generation, not like little wooden frame pictures on the wall, and I made every print 5 feet high, and the horizontals were 5 feet by 8 feet. And there were 4 prints in the exhibition that were 10 feet.
Wow.
So, and the idea was to simply use every square inch that I could of the museum walls to plaster the whole thing like a gigantic wallpaper. And I called the project Insta Rome. So it's basically like an Instagram. And the images were unconnected with each other. So you may have a nude woman next to a monument, next to a portrait of a bird. So there was no, and of course, I was careful how they went up, but to the average person, it would seem quite chaotic, but it was intentionally chaotic. And if you go back to just Instagram, the way that people look at pictures now, you'll see people slide across picture after picture after picture. So people can adjust things. So when you look at Instagram, it's not necessarily all children. You can be looking at a car crash and then there's a girl in a bikini and then there's something else selling you a shirt or something,
Yeah.
So I like that idea for the thing. So when you go in and you can look at pictures of the way it was put together, you can see that when you go in, it's definitely overwhelming because there's so many images, and because the images are so big, that gives you a certain it gives you a certain rush when you see everything, like how can you digest it all and so on. But it was enormously successful with young people. A lot of the university graphic designers who came and painters who came, they loved it. So far so good.
Yeah. And why were the first 8 days so important? And why did you really want to connect with the younger generations for this Rome project?
I didn't.
If you want to go from no podcast and 0 subscribers to a professional looking and sounding podcast with big named guests, loyal audience, and a lot of momentum in 3 months, the link for my step-by-step video podcast blueprint program is in the description below. If you sign up and buy that, you'll also get my episodes 24 hours early. You'll get guest previews. You'll be able to ask guests questions for me to ask them on my show. You also meet a group of like-minded, curious people who want to start their own podcast and understand the world around them. So link to that in the description. Let's get on to the next section.
I'm a Beatles generation, that basically the same age. So I was actually, believe it or not, a little bit younger than Beatles. But there was always an interesting thing with the Beatles, a piece of trivia for you. When the Beatles came out and everybody thought they were fabulous and so on. And then when they first put out the Beatles' age, John Lennon was 2 years younger than me. And I thought, well, that's fine. It was kind of a curiosity thing. But then when the dust settled and they became the Beatles, and then towards the end of their Beatles career, you kind of found out that actually John Lennon wasn't 2 years younger than me, he was 2 years older than me, and so was Ringo. And then George Harrison was a year younger, and Paul McCartney and I are the same age, So it's kind of like I'm part of that generation. But I think because it was a pretty solid generation, it was basically everybody that you can think of at that time, all of the music groups. The majority of them were born during the war or at the end of the war, maybe 47, 48. So that generation of, even a little bit later, even David Bowie a little bit later, I think is 51, I think. So, but that was a very bleak time in Britain.
Yeah.
After the war, it was a good solid kind of 15 years before there was a recovery in place. So I remember things being pretty bleak. And one of the things that was always inspiring was that you had American music. So it was the age of beginnings of real rock and roll at that point in the mid-50s, and Elvis Presley and everybody. So that was that's the generation I'm from. And therefore I think it was a generation that you would want to connect with all groups of people, not just young people, but older people too. But I did target younger people with their philosophy because I thought it was a good exercise.
Yeah. And what keeps you motivated after so many decades of success in the industry, and especially during maybe more tough times? How do you overcome challenges?
Well, a simple answer to that. It's just I've always been obsessed by photography and the cameras. And when I pick up a camera, you lose track of time. So there's no trick answer or to it other than an obsession. And a lot of, there's a sad thing about photography, because I've met so many photographers and I've trained so many photographers and I've done master classes. There's a sad group, especially men, who get sucked into photography because they love the equipment.
Yeah.
And I always give the analogy again, going back to a car. My father used to spend, really 10 hours on a Sunday working on his car. When I say 10 hours, I mean 10 hours. He would actually have a sandwich lunch when he was working on his car. And then at the end of the day, he would take my mother for a ride, which would approximately last 15 minutes. So he'd spend 10 hours on the car and then take my mother for a ride around the hills, he would say, and then he would come back. And every 15 minutes, it wouldn't go away for 2 hours. It was 15 minutes he came back. That was it. And basically, he was taking my mother for a ride, yes, but I really wanted to make sure the car was running properly. So in other words, he was obsessed by the equipment. He loved the car. He loved it sitting there and as an object. And there's a lot of people get sucked into photography because they like the equipment. They like the object. And they do like taking pictures. But in my opinion, sometimes they don't. They're more obsessed with the equipment than they are actually the pictures. Because I've seen a lot of people that are very knowledgeable, technically knowledgeable. And I think sometimes with some photographers I've met in master classes and things like that, they're sometimes a little bit disappointed that I'm not more obsessed with the equipment, and so on. I say, look, I'm the equipment is an essential part, but it's not. I would never be obsessed by a camera, that never was an issue. It's what the photos you take are what the obsession is.
Yeah.
That's what keeps me going.
Is that what holds maybe the amateur back, is their kind of overly obsession on equipment rather than technique and lighting, for example.
Why do you say amateur? I've got tons of professionals.
Really?
Oh, of course there are. There's tons of
Wow.
professionals that take terrible pictures. What can I say? What do you do for a living? I do headshots for models, and the pictures are pretty average, and every girl looks the same, and they're pretty boring. And he has a one setup, and he charges £100 to take some, basically some pictures of models or something like that, and he doesn't do anything really with them. The pictures are always the same. There's never a layer on top, something on top of, So it's not only amateurs. There are a lot of you're right. There are a lot of amateurs like that. I mean, my dentist was a Leica fanatic. I mean, if there was a new camera came out announced, I mean, he didn't even read the information on it. He just bought it. I mean, there was no question. He would show me all these cases with all these Leicas, He had far more cameras than I had. He asked me, how many cameras do you have? And I said, basically 3 of each as a backup, And so, we had 1 4x5, 1 8x10, 3 Hasselblads, and 2 Nikons, and that was it. Yet there was no other cameras, that you might have a point and shoot for your holidays or something, but that was it.
Yeah.
So I think, you should care about your equipment. You should look after your equipment. Doesn't mean you throw it in a box and you don't care. You should look after your equipment, make sure that it's functional and so on, but never become obsessed by it,
Yeah. And who are your heroes? Who are some photographers that you've learned the most from and took the most inspiration from?
Well, I think a lot of the American school was pretty good. I liked, like the typical ones like Avedon and Penn.
Yeah.
I liked some of the reportage guys like William Klein. And I never wanted to be anything like him, but I liked Cartier-Bresson, but just as somebody I liked, I always liked the French photographer Guy Bourdin. I thought Guy Bourdin was an exceptional photographer, but I liked more the photographers sometimes who worked in the fashion business as opposed to fashion photographers. So if you think of Richard Avedon was a photographer, Irving Penn was a photographer, Guy Bourdin was a photographer, William Klein, who did do work for Vogue, he was a photographer, and you have other, well-known photographers. Annie Leibovitz is a well-known portraiturist and a very good, solid photographer. But I like the photographers more than the fashion photographers. The photographers who did fashion interested me. Fashion photographers didn't particularly interest me.
Why did they interest you?
Because the pictures had longevity. That's what interested me. I was always interested in fashion pictures that had longevity. And I'm so fascinated that people can, through a gallery, can find a picture that I did in 1978, which is now 47 years ago, and they want to buy a signed copy of that. So, and a lot of the fashion pictures now do very well in that open market because they're more photographs. They're not fashion pictures. And there's sometimes a problem with that. I can sometimes agreed with the fashion people that sometimes the photographer's pictures simply got too heavy for the general public, and they became a little bit too monumental and too, I don't know what you would call it, too heavy is a good word, actually. And a lot of the fashion photographers had a lightness to their work, and therefore it was easier to digest. But some of, Guy Bourdin's pictures were not easy to digest, but they were works of art. So I'm sure he didn't care about that.
Yeah. And how can you increase your chances of your images having longevity? And maybe what are some ways for you to guarantee that your images won't have?
They have to be pretty solidly memorable, and they have to have something in them a little bit there's a lot of words that you can use. There has to be something a little bit iconic in them. They have to have some weight. Weight's not a bad word. It's a bit boring, but it's a weight, meaning that it has good technical authority. The print, I've always been a printer. We always controlled our prints, always. And I realized very early on when digital came along, I realized that you had to bring all of that in-house, that all of that had to be brought in-house. So, now I have 2 full-time Photoshop people that I work with all the files and everything like that. So they're with me every day. So when we make exhibitions like the one in Rome, and we have a large retrospective next year, and we started working on that last week. So
is control incredibly important? Is it better to keep everything in-house than it is to maybe outsource the printing to another company? And why is that the case?
Sure. For me, it is because this idea of you send a print out and it comes back and you go, it needs a little bit more magenta. Now, what is, in today's technology, what does a little bit mean? Now, a little bit doesn't mean 80% more magenta, but does it mean 2%? Well, 2% might not be enough. It might need 4.5%, or it might need 5%. And so you say, okay, give me 5% more magenta, and the picture come back, and 5% was not enough. It needs 8%, and then 8% come back, but then another aspect of the picture looks a little bit too magenta. So fix one aspect of the picture, but caused a problem in another area. Whereas stuff like that, if you're working on it yourself, you can fix that in minutes without it going backwards and forward with files, So when you create master files now with a master print, you should be home and dry.
Yeah.
You did it yourself. It's your print. If people like it, we did it. If they don't like it, you can blame us.
Is it a kind of a process of trial and error? So for a young photographer wanting to improve their print quality and kind of become a master at printing, maybe for a fine art market, it's the best thing to do it yourself and do it by trial and error.
Well, you should be able to do it yourself, right?
Yeah.
It's not you should be able to do it. I don't know. It's like, if you've got a leaky tap in your kitchen and you call in a plumber and the plumber says, oh, I've got a friend that does taps. Aren't you a plumber? Yes, but I don't do taps.
Yeah.
It's not one of my specialties, something you should be able to do it. If you're interested in what goes on a piece of paper, then you should do it. It's not like, I've spoken to well-known photographers who said, oh, I've got a good guy in LA. I send him out there. Like, what? And then he sends me a test strip. And I look at the test strip, and I say, test strip, how big? A 1620 print, 3-inch. I said, well, 3-inch. So I quickly kind of did the math on it and said, okay, 3 inches there. That's about 15% of the picture. What about the other part? And he said, well, he always does a good job. So that's it's just a difference of opinion,
Yeah.
Difference of opinion. I mean, you can look at Anna Leibovitz's prints when you see them in a magazine. You can tell she doesn't do them because they have a signature color code in them that she likes, which is fine. But then that color code is put into the pictures,
Is that the same for business skills as well? Doing that yourself, or is that something you could potentially outsource, maybe contacting galleries or putting your stuff on social media, advertising your work? Is that a skill photographers should try and master too?
Well, they should be. I just think it's part of photography. You should be able to. Why would you not want to make a print of your own work? And why would you not enjoy doing that? And why would you not then notice what's possible? My God. And why give that to somebody else?
Definitely.
Why give that to somebody else?
And in terms of printing, what role does scarcity and size of the print, how does that affect maybe the value of the work? Is it something that you need to kind of learn as well? Is it the bigger the print, the more expensive it's going to be, and the scarcer the print is going to be more expensive as well? Or does it depend?
I don't think we're never selling prints based on the cost per square inch.
Mhm.
It's the reason I did the Rome show like that, every print 5 feet high or bigger, was because the museums, it's a classic museum. When you walk in, that's 60-foot ceilings. So therefore,
Yeah.
sometimes you do a print that's, let's say, 30 inches. That's quite a big print, 30 inches, you might say. But you put 30 inches on a museum wall that has a 60-foot ceiling, and the thing looks like a postage stamp. And of course, what would happen is somebody goes close to it, which is fine. You view it close up, and so it's not a bad thing, no way. But just I wanted to do much more of a wallpaper that it's just everything was surrounded you. All of the prints surrounded you on 3 sides, and sometimes 4 sides.
Mm.
So that was the idea for it. But the prints, a small 8x10 can have just as much value as an 8-foot by 10-foot.
Mm. Does it really depend on the image? So can an image look better as 8x10, but then if you expanded it to 8 feet by 10 feet, it would look much worse?
No, it's not that. If the image has power, I mean, some of it is, maybe some people would go right up to it and be 12 inches from a huge print because they might be interested in the texture. But I've always been somebody that liked high definition and also like incredibly grainy pictures.
Mm.
I have no problem looking at what's on the wall and it's very grainy, or you go the image that's behind me here. If I move this over a little, like that image there is the image behind me is 5 feet by 7.5 feet.
Yeah.
Here, so if you look there, it's you can kind of see it there on the other side if you look there. So that image there is approximately about 210, 220 megapixels. So it's incredibly sharp. You can count the eyelashes on it. But there may be other pictures, like the one above there, is that's a Leica picture of a train, a surface train at nighttime, middle of the night in Rome. And that's a Leica picture, which is about 60 megapixels. So we have other ones that are a 60 megapixel camera. There's a shot in the show of a giraffe with showgirls, and that's pretty grainy because it's half of the frame. So it's maybe 25 megapixels or even less. So there's much more noise in it and it's more grainy, but it still is a beautiful image for me. So size here was just impact of the show and what I did in 34 days in Rome. That was, and you have 3 massive galleries to look at. And so therefore the multiplicity of the prints, the size is there for impact and to make it attractive to look at and interesting to look at, as opposed to these big galleries that had 5 paintings in them and people spend 2 minutes looking at 5 paintings in the same galleries. And because when I first went to the museum, they actually had 6, they had two on 3 of the walls. They had 6 paintings and people would spend 2 minutes looking at the paintings and walk out the gallery. I mean, I didn't want that to happen. And I wanted them to, if you spend 2 minutes in one of my galleries and you really didn't look, you could not answer a questionnaire, So people do spend time there. They spend a lot of time and they spend a lot of time doing iPhone pictures in front of them, stuff like that. So that I enjoy.
Yeah. Mentioning grain, why do you think a lot of photographers don't like grain in their images?
I think it's a matter of choice. I like pictures hyper sharp and hyper grainy. I like all of that. It's all photography, so I like it. I was always a big fan of Seurat, the French post-impressionist, because his drawings were super grainy. He worked on a rough paper with a crayon, and it made the picture very grainy and impressionistic. So, I mean, of course I like that.
Hmm. And the shot behind you is quite a flat background that's quite evenly distributed. There's not much noise or clutter in that shot. I was just wondering, what role does background play in your images, maybe in your studio shots, and how do you decide what background to use for each shoot? Where do you get inspiration for that?
I think a lot of it is at this stage, because I've been doing it for so long, that sometimes I'm afraid, and I'm very sorry to go back to the car.
It's fine.
But when you sit in the car and you're about to pull out, you look in the mirror. And to be quite honest, if you check your brain, you could say to your brain, wait a minute, how did you know how to do that? Because you did it automatic. You know, you didn't sit in the car and say, I think I'll now look in the mirror to make sure nobody's coming. You basically, you could even be on a phone call and do it. You indicate, look in the mirror, and you can be in the middle of a conversation with somebody and do it. So I think the idea of selecting backgrounds and taking pictures and how you do it, that at that point, there's certain times that people ask me, they see a video of me taking a picture, and a lot of young photographers, it's a valid question. They say, how did you know how to do that? And sometimes I can't answer it. And I think if you asked me that question when I first started, then I'd probably be able to answer it. But things like density of a background, how bright the background should be there behind that woman there, and the backlights on it are filtered with cyan. So, and then I wanted the picture to have a soft cyan look to it with a little bit of green in it almost. And therefore you can look at paintings, be inspired by paintings to do that, and so on. So try and create something special and unique, and working. And it was interesting. Like, she's a young actress in Rome, and she'd never been nude in front of the camera, which I found interesting. And therefore how do you handle that? That's another thing. Take your clothes off.
How did
Please.
you handle that? How did you handle that with her, if it was her first time?
Um, I think in a weird way, especially at the beginning of the picture, you tend to look through them. You don't look at what they're revealing to you. You just assume it's like use a Perrier bottle, and you kind of look through it, and you immediately start saying, well, it's better if I do it at an angle. Here, the body's at an angle, and turn the head a little bit, and you start concentrating on the shot, and you're never looking at the body. But to say something stupid, of course you're looking at the body, because you're making sure that the composition is good and the movement. And in case somebody asks you, well, if you're doing what camera is giving you 220 megapixels, there's not really a camera that gives you that I know of, that gives you, but a phase one camera has got 150 megapixels.
Yeah.
Right. And very often with the right lens, you can do 1, 2, or 3 frames of that. You could theoretically create an image that's 500 megapixel by splicing, doing an overlap, a small overlap. So if you take 3 frames with a 200 megapixel camera, essentially that's 600, but minus the overlap, you're probably about 560 megapixels. So you have the choice of that.
Yeah.
Or not. Or you might do a handheld shot with a Leica, and it becomes a little bit blurry, or it has some movement in it, and so on. It all depends what ends up on a piece of linen. They were all printed on linen, these shots, and cotton and linen. So they're all on fabrics, which I like very much, because the surface, it's a fine linen and cotton. So therefore the surface from further back can almost a little bit feel like paper, but when you go up close to it, you can feel that it's on fabric, and they're just simply pinned on the museum wall. So it's very, very simple.
Yeah. You've done many shoots with many iconic people and groups of people, and I'm wondering, what was the most stressful shoot that you've done, if you have one in particular, and how did you persevere and succeed during that shoot and get over that hurdle?
Um, I think there's only one shoot really we've, I mean, lots of shoots you're disappointed with, and you see, I should have done this and I should have done that. And sometimes you've missed things just by being, you should have done something. And I remember at the 1994 Woodstock that the manager of Bob Dylan, I was backstage, and I had a studio near the backstage, a miniature studio, pretty good, about 20 feet by 20 feet. And the manager came to me and said, Bob's doing the show, but he's pretty frail right now. So he wants to do the show and then get out of there. And he said, but I'll introduce you to him when he's going on stage, and you can ask him and speak to him and so on. So I said, okay, I'll come down. And I was down there for 5 minutes. And then there was this big kind of semi truck backed onto the stage. And out of it came 8 massive Hell's Angels guys, tattooed, leather, a lot of them with sunglasses on, and big men. And in the middle of them was Bob Dylan carrying he looked tiny. He's not very tall, but I think he's like 5'7", 5'6". And then amongst these guys, he looked tiny. And he had Ray-Bans on, and he came out the back of that truck, and I didn't have a camera. Even after all these years of experience, you still kind of make mistakes like that. I should have had a camera with me. And then he went straight on the stage, and then he left after. I never spoke to him.
Oh,
Although he did call about 2 or 3 years ago, because he wanted to use a shot that I had done, not of him, but of somebody else, of a guy collapsing on stage with a guitar that I had shot. And I can't remember what the album was called. Something had blood on the stage or something. And he wanted to use that as the cover. And he didn't want a picture of himself on the cover. He wanted that shot. And eventually they used it on the back of the cover, not the front. But he called and asked if he could use it. And I said, sure, because it wasn't it was just a shot that he'd seen of mine. It wasn't what you might call an iconic museum shot. It was a good image, but obviously he wanted it, so it had some value. And he did use it. But it's just to let you see that even after years of experience, you should be able. I should have known that when I walked down there. I should have been alert to that, So sometimes you can, the best laid plans of mice and men.
Albert Watson, ladies and gentlemen. Albert, thank you so much for your time, and you're one of my biggest inspirations. I love so many of your photos, and I hope the audience learned as much as I did today about your work and your process and your fantastic career. What are you working on at the moment, and where can people find your work?
Well, you should try and source, because the book just came out from the Rome show.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful book. It looks like a Bible, and it's a very nice book, and it feels like the show, looks like the show. And that just came out. And right now, as I said earlier, I just started to work on a retrospective of next year for a museum show next year. The Rome show will travel. It's going to Shanghai first. And then it's going to Washington, D.C., the Rome show. But then the retrospective show, I'm preparing that right now. So that's what I'm working on. Plus, I'm doing shootings. I still do shootings.
Brilliant. I'll leave the relevant links to your work in the show notes for the audience to access and look for themselves. Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully see you in the future.
Sure. It's a pleasure.
If you want to know the full step-by-step process I use to go from 0 subscribers and 0 guests and 0 idea of how to start a podcast to a ton of high-end guests, professional looking video, professional looking audio quality, social media clips of the podcast that have generated over 2.5 million views in the last 2 to 3 months. And join my tribe of outliers. It's a community for curious, like-minded people who either want to start their own podcast. You'll get access to my step-by-step podcast blueprint program. You'll finally be able to meet your like-minded tribe of people who are into podcasting, into self-growth, and into understanding the world around them. Because let's be real, the people that are into those 3 things are very rare individuals. That's why I called it Tribe of Outliers. So if you want to know how to start your podcast using the blueprint I used to go from 0 to a successful show that's continuing to grow to this day, literally I'll hold your hand and walk you through the step-by-step process, including how to email guests, what to put in your emails, how to edit it, how to repurpose it, how to use Riverside FM software, but also how to do it all with the equipment. Join weekly live calls with myself and the tribe, helping you improve your podcast and yourself every single week. It's an absolute no-brainer. So if you want to become an outlier today and join the tribe of like-minded people and get direct access to me and my blueprints, which have helped me improve my podcast, click the link in the description